My husband is an FBI agent. We stood in the crowded living room of his family's annual December reunion in 2010 when he suddenly reached over and snatched the crystal highball glass from my hand. "Don't touch anything else," Gideon whispered. His voice lacked any warmth, stripped down to the flat, mechanical tone he used for field operations. I watched his pulse hammer against the line of his jaw. 1 minute later, the ambient chatter of 30 relatives died instantly. Gideon drew his service weapon, angled the barrel downward, and stepped between me and his mother, Sylvia. He looked at his own family with eyes I had never seen in our home. "Who exactly gave my wife that glass?" Nobody moved. Sylvia's champagne flute hovered inches from her mouth. My brother-in-law, Trent, froze with a cocktail napkin half folded in his hands. They stared at the weapon, utterly terrified. What they did not know, what Gideon himself was only just realizing, was that I had already tested the drink. I already knew exactly what lethal accelerant they slipped into the ice, and I had already dismantled their entire criminal empire 3 hours before the party even started. If you have ever watched a toxic family try to erase you because you knew too much, this story is for you. What would you do if the people meant to protect you tried to silence you? Drop a comment below. And be sure to subscribe. The leaves along the Potomac began to turn a brittle copper in late September of 2010. I built my entire existence around the concept of invisibility. 3 days a week. I drove my 9-year-old sedan, a vehicle with a rattling exhaust and fading silver paint, into the faculty parking lot of a local community college. I spent my afternoons in a windowless room smelling of dry erase dust and stale break room coffee, tutoring 19-year-olds who stared blankly at introductory accounting ledgers. To Gideon's family, that sedan defined my ceiling. I served as their favorite cautionary tale. I was the low-wage wife, the charity case, the woman who dragged down their carefully curated pedigree. They demanded our attendance at Sunday dinners. Sylvia, the family matriarch, held these gatherings in her formal dining room, a space she treated like a royal court. I usually sat near the kitchen door, the furthest position from the head of the mahogany table. Trent, Gideon's older brother, permanently occupied the seat of honor. He liked to throw his leather key fob onto the console the moment he walked into the house, ensuring the expensive emblem caught the entryway lighting. He wore bespoke Italian wool suits and checked a heavy, platinum chronograph on his wrist every 5 minutes, projecting the illusion of a man whose time cost fortunes. His wife, Fiona, mirrored his arrogance, tapping manicured fingernails against crystal goblets, draped in seasonal designer pieces. During a dinner in mid-October, Sylvia handed me the guest plates, the ceramic ones with the chipped edges, while she arranged the gold-rimmed china for Trent and Fiona. She looked down at my scuffed, sensible flats. "Claire, dear, the college must have a dress code. I could donate some of my old slacks. You look like you just finished a shift at a diner." I took the chipped plates. I did not frown. I did not apologize. "I appreciate the offer, Sylvia. These work perfectly fine." I kept my tone entirely flat. Fiona thrived on blood sport. She required a stronger reaction. Later in the meal, she leaned across the table to pass a heavy platter of roasted vegetables. She did not lose her balance. Her heel did not slip against the hardwood. She simply tilted her wrist, angling her glass of Bordeaux directly over my lap. The dark red liquid dropped in a heavy splash. It soaked instantly into the fabric of my beige wool coat, bleeding across the lapel and pooling cold against my skirt. The scent of fermented grapes filled the space between us. The table went dead silent. Sylvia paused with her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. Trent smirked, reaching for his water glass to mask his amusement. Fiona pressed a hand to her collarbone, her eyes wide, performing a flawless pantomime of shock. "Oh, Claire, I am so terribly clumsy. That coat looks like it came from a discount rack anyway. I will write you a check for $50. She waited for the tears. She waited for the flush of humiliation, the trembling lip, the desperate, embarrassed rush to the powder room. She wanted the room to watch me break. I placed my linen napkin on the table. I did not blink. I inhaled through my nose, measuring the intake of air. 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. My heart rate held steady at 60 beats per minute. I looked at the dark stain spreading across my knee, then looked back at Fiona's eager, waiting face. I picked up my fork, speared a piece of asparagus, and took a slow, deliberate bite. "The coat is fine, Fiona," I said. My voice carried no tremor. I chewed, swallowed, and took a sip of my sparkling water. Fiona's smile fractured. The script required my devastation. My absolute refusal to flinch stripped the weapon directly from her hands. Gideon shifted violently in his chair, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table ready to intervene. I caught his eye and gave a fractional shake of my head. Let them have their theater. When we drove home that night, Gideon gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles stark white in the dashboard light. "You do not have to take that," he ground out, staring at the taillights ahead of us. "I can shut her down. I can shut all of them down." "If you shut her down, they learn they can reach us," I replied, resting my head against the cold glass of the passenger window. "Anger gives them leverage. Silence starves them." Gideon exhaled slowly. He knew exactly who sat beside him. His family saw a docile, impoverished tutor. They did not know that 3 years prior. I occupied a glass-walled office in Washington. I served as a senior forensic auditor for the United States Treasury Department, specializing in anti-money laundering enforcement. I spent a decade dismantling corporate syndicates. I traced phantom assets through offshore shell companies, unraveled complex Cayman Islands trusts, and froze accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I did not flinch when cartel-backed hedge fund managers threatened my life. I did not lose sleep when corrupt bankers lost their estates. I sat across from Wall Street executives and watched them sweat through silk shirts as I pushed their federal indictments across conference tables in plain manila folders. I left that life intentionally. The constant exposure to human greed, the endless games of corporate sociopathy, hollowed me out. I wanted quiet. I wanted the mindless rhythm of grading basic ledger equations where the numbers meant nothing more than a passing grade. I met Gideon during a cross-agency task force seminar, fell in love with his absolute integrity, and walked away from the financial bloodbaths. I traded my federal clearance for a beat-up sedan and a backyard garden. I kept my expertise buried because peace held infinitely more value to me than power. But you never forget how to read the numbers. The architecture of illicit wealth leaves a specific, undeniable footprint. And, by the fall of 2010, Gideon's family left footprints everywhere they stepped. I observed the discrepancies silently from my corner seat at their dinners. Sylvia embarked on a massive home renovation in September. I watched private contractors carry slabs of imported Italian marble through her foyer. She tipped the foreman in cash, pulling crisp $100 bills from a bank envelope she kept in her kitchen drawer. A retired widow drawing a standard life insurance pension does not fund a $500,000 remodel with unrecorded currency. Then there was Trent. Trent operated a boutique real estate development firm, proudly boasting about his commercial acquisitions at a volume designed to force everyone else in the room to stop talking. Yet, his building sites remained vacant lots overgrown with weeds. I drove past his properties on my way to the college. I saw no bulldozers. I saw no framing crews. I saw no poured concrete. Just empty dirt surrounded by chain-link fences. Despite this total lack of operational revenue, Trent drove a custom German sports car that retailed for $250,000. He gifted Fiona diamond tennis bracelets. He financed Sylvia's marble floors. I sat at their dining table, eating their roast beef, watching them perform their superiority. They mocked my thrift store coat. They mocked my salary. They believed their display of wealth proved their total dominance over me. They did not realize they were bleeding federal evidence. I cataloged the offshore wire fees Trent casually complained about over dessert. I noted the specific Caribbean banking hubs he mentioned during his arrogant business calls on the terrace. The math screamed, You cannot generate millions in liquid cash from empty dirt lots. The funds entered their ecosystem without a legitimate point of origin. Trent washed money. The spring coiled tighter with every insult they threw at me. They thought they had cornered a weak, defenseless mouse. They had no idea they invited an apex predator into their accounts. I let them pay the dinner tabs. I let them sneer at my car. I let Fiona spill her wine. I folded my hands in my lap, breathed in, breathed out, and waited for them to hand me the knife. The trap arrived disguised as an act of familial charity. 2 weeks after the wine stained my coat, we gathered again in Sylvia's formal dining room for a Sunday roast. Rain battered the terrace doors, a cold, driving downpour typical for early November of 2010. Sylvia waited until the plates were cleared. She walked to the credenza, picked up a heavy cardboard banker's box, and carried it to the table. She dropped it next to my water glass. The impact rattled the silverware. "Trent needs a favor," Sylvia announced, reclaiming her seat at the head of the table. Trent lounged in his chair, swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal tumbler. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes locked on a muted football game playing on the television in the adjacent den. I looked at the box. The lid sat askew, revealing chaotic stacks of crumpled receipts, unsealed envelopes, and haphazardly folded bank statements. "Trent is expanding his limited liability companies," Sylvia continued, gesturing vaguely toward the mess. "His real estate portfolio demands so much of his time. He needs someone to organize his files and handle some minor bookkeeping for the upcoming tax season. Nothing complicated, just simple math." Fiona rested her chin on her hand, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light. "You have so much free time in the afternoons, Claire. Tutoring those community college kids cannot possibly take up your whole day. It would be good for you to stretch your brain." "We figure we can keep this in the family," Trent added. Finally tearing his gaze away from the screen, he offered a tight, patronizing smirk. "No need to pay a professional firm for basic data entry. Consider it a learning opportunity." I rested my hands on the mahogany table. I understood the architecture of their request instantly. Wealthy individuals engaged in legitimate enterprise do not hand unredacted financial records to untrained relatives. They hire certified public accountants. They construct ironclad walls of confidentiality. When a man driving a $250,000 sports car refuses to pay a standard retainer fee for a bookkeeper, he is not exercising frugality. He is hunting for a human shield. They wanted a naive signatory. They needed an expendable, low-status target to attach her name to the bottom of the ledgers. Someone who could absorb the legal blowback if the Internal Revenue Service ever triggered an audit. By their calculation, if the numbers failed to align, Trent could simply shrug, point to his incompetent sister-in-law, and claim administrative error. Gideon opened his mouth, his brow furrowed, preparing to reject the box on my behalf. I reached out and rested my fingers gently over his wrist. "I can look at them," I said. My voice betrayed no emotion. Sylvia offered a crisp, satisfied nod. "Excellent. I knew you would want to contribute." I carried the box to my car that evening. It weighed roughly 30 pounds. To Sylvia and Trent, it represented a brilliant manipulation, a way to offload risk onto a useless dependent. To me, it represented total, unmitigated access. At midnight, Gideon fell asleep, exhausted from a long shift at the bureau. I left our bedroom. Walking quietly down the hall to my home office, I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and turned on the single brass desk lamp. I set the banker's box on the center of my desk and removed the lid. To an untrained eye, the contents represented a chaotic nightmare. Crumpled gas station receipts sat mixed with commercial lease agreements. Utility bills were stapled to blank pieces of paper. The disorder was intentional, designed to overwhelm a novice and force them to simply tally the totals without questioning the narrative. I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt the familiar, cold precision of a predator stepping into its natural hunting ground. I pulled a blank legal pad from my drawer and uncapped a black fountain pen. I did not need weeks to unravel Trent's financial empire. I needed exactly 20 minutes. I began sorting the documents, establishing a strict chronological perimeter. I separated the bank statements from the physical receipts. I ignored the chaotic noise the coffee shop purchases, the dry cleaning bills, and focused entirely on the high-volume outflows. The pattern emerged before I even opened my laptop. Legitimate property developers operate on predictable cycles of debt and asset acquisition. They secure commercial loans. They pay licensed contractors. And they file municipal permits. Trent's ledgers lacked all of these standard markers. Instead, I found phantom vendors. I smoothed out an invoice from a company listed as Apex Contracting Solutions. The invoice billed Trent's primary limited liability company for $85,000 for foundation pouring. I cross-referenced the property address listed on the invoice. It matched the vacant, weed-choked dirt lot I drove past every Tuesday on my way to the college. No foundation existed. I traced the payments. Trent never cut a single check for the full $85,000. The bank statements revealed a relentless series of cash deposits and immediate outgoing wire transfers. $9,900 on a Tuesday, $9,500 on a Thursday, $8,990 the following Monday. My pen scratched rhythmically against the legal pad. Structuring. Trent kept every single transaction just under the $10,000 threshold, explicitly avoiding the mandatory currency transaction reports that banks automatically file with the federal government. He was smurfing cash, breaking massive sums of illicit currency into small, unnoticeable deposits, and pushing them into the commercial banking system. I opened my encrypted laptop and utilized a masked browser to run the employer identification numbers listed on the invoices. Apex Contracting Solutions held no state business license. It possessed no physical storefront. Its registered address traced back to a vacant post office box in Delaware. Trent was not a real estate developer. The bespoke suits, the heavy watches, the arrogant posturing, it was all a hollow facade. He was a low-level washer, a mule in a suit. I traced the outgoing wire transfers. The structured deposits did not stay in Trent's domestic accounts, within 48 hours of the cash hitting his bank. He wired the funds to secondary holding accounts. I recognized the routing prefixes immediately. The money flowed directly into offshore banking hubs in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. The sheer scale of the operation eclipsed Trent's intellectual capacity. You do not set up offshore holding companies and Delaware shells by accident. You do not generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit cash without a massive supply chain. Trent was a designated node in a cartel syndicate, acting as the domestic washing machine for organizations that murdered people over loose change. I sat back in my chair. The house remained utterly silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I pressed 2 fingers against the pulse point on my neck. My heart rate beat in a slow, steady rhythm, 60 beats per minute. I looked at the cardboard box sitting under the yellow glow of my desk lamp. The arrogance defied comprehension. To save a few $1,000s in basic accounting fees, Sylvia and Trent actively avoided hiring a licensed professional who would have demanded legally binding confidentiality agreements. Instead, they handed unredacted federal evidence, the exact blueprint of their cartel-backed money laundering operation, directly to a former senior forensic auditor for the United States Treasury Department. They wanted a naive, uneducated victim to sign their fraudulent tax returns. They wanted a human shield. They constructed their own guillotine, loaded the blade, and placed the release lever directly into my hands. I did not smile. I did not feel a rush of vindictive adrenaline. I felt the cold, mechanical certainty of an executioner verifying a warrant. I closed the lid on the banker's box, turned off the desk lamp, and walked back to bed, leaving their ruined future sitting quietly in the dark. November 2010 blew in with a bitter, unforgiving frost. During the first 3 weeks of the month, I perfected the role of the overwhelmed, incompetent subordinate. I knew I needed direct access to Trent's master server to secure the final, unassailable pieces of evidence, The physical receipts provided the footprint, but the digital ledger contained the DNA of the cartel syndicate. To acquire the master password, I needed to make Trent believe my incompetence posed a greater threat to his operation than my access. I walked into his home office on a Tuesday afternoon. I clutched a stack of printed spreadsheets against my chest. I rounded my shoulders, adopting the posture of a woman terrified of making a mistake. "Trent," I said, keeping my pitch high and uncertain. I placed a single sheet of paper on his glass desk. "I am struggling with the reconciliation. I keep finding these routing numbers. They start with a prefix I do not recognize. Something in Cyprus. And there are outgoing wires to the Cayman Islands. I think I entered the data wrong on the spreadsheet. The balances look entirely unbalanced. I do not want to ruin your tax filings." Trent froze. He snapped his laptop shut. The sharp crack of the plastic echoed in the room. He exhaled a harsh breath through his nose and snatched the paper from the desk. I watched the skin around his eyes tighten. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his face a splotchy, uneven gray. "You are reading it wrong, Claire," he snapped, his voice tight. "These are standard domestic vendor codes. You are mixing up the columns. You are shifting the decimals." "Oh," I whispered, shrinking back toward the door. "I am sorry. The paperwork is just so chaotic. If I could just log into the main server, I could cross-reference the original invoices. It would help me fix my mistakes without bothering you." He glared at me, weighing the risk. He looked at my faded cardigan. He saw a community college tutor who struggled with basic addition. He typed a complex sequence of letters and numbers onto a yellow sticky note and shoved it across the desk. "Do not mess up the master files. Fix your errors and leave the international codes alone." I took the note. I walked out of his office, drove home, and immediately mirrored his entire hard drive onto my encrypted federal drive. They realized their exposure. Handing me the physical box of receipts was a mistake born of arrogance. My innocent questions about Cyprus proved I possessed enough basic literacy to accidentally detonate their empire. They needed a contingency plan. They needed to discredit the witness. They launched their offensive on the fourth Thursday of November. Thanksgiving dinner unfolded in Sylvia's dining room. She orchestrated the event like a military campaign, demanding absolute aesthetic perfection. Crystal stemware gleamed under the heavy chandelier. Silver serving platters held roasted turkey, glazed root vegetables, and imported cheeses. I sat in my usual chair near the kitchen swinging door, the draft from the hallway chilling my ankles. The psychological assault began during the second course. Trent poured himself a third glass of neat bourbon. He leaned back, hooking an arm over the mahogany frame of his chair. He looked down the length of the table, bypassing me entirely to lock eyes with Gideon. "You need to buy your wife a calculator, little brother," Trent announced. His voice carried across the room, harsh and commanding, forcing the ambient chatter to cease. I gave her a box of simple receipts, basic data entry. A high school intern could manage it. She is seeing phantom accounts. She is tracking money to islands that do not exist in my portfolio. Fiona giggled, pressing a linen napkin to her mouth. She looked at me with undisguised delight, waiting for my face to flush. I placed my fork on the table. I aligned it perfectly parallel to my knife. I ensured the tines pointed exactly toward the platinum rim of my plate. I did not look up. I did not blink. I kept my breathing measured. Sylvia placed her wine glass down. She folded her hands and leaned toward Gideon, adopting a posture of profound, sorrowful maternal concern. "Gideon, darling, we are worried," Sylvia murmured, though she pitched her voice loudly enough for the entire table to hear every syllable. Gideon stopped eating. He lowered his silverware. The muscles in his jaw locked. He stared at his mother. "Worried about what?" "Claire's state of mind," Sylvia said, sighing heavily. "She brought Trent a ledger yesterday. It was filled with paranoid scribbles. She is imagining transactions that never occurred. Perhaps the stress of the college is too much for her. Women in her position often crack under pressure. She is making up numbers. Gideon. She is hallucinating financial records." I sat perfectly still and observed the room. I evaluated their physiological tells with the clinical detachment of a forensic examiner. I watched the pulse flutter rapidly against the collar of Trent's bespoke shirt. I watched him wipe a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Despite the aggressive air conditioning running in the dining room, I registered the unnatural, piercing pitch of Sylvia's voice. They did not think I was stupid. They felt the cold, suffocating grip of absolute terror. They recognized that I saw the offshore routing codes. They understood the federal implications of those numbers. They needed to immediately establish a narrative of my mental instability. If I ever mentioned Cyprus or the Cayman Islands to Gideon, they wanted him preconditioned to dismiss my words as the paranoid delusions of a broken, stressed woman. They sought to poison the well. They executed a classic gaslighting technique, attempting to rewrite reality to protect their illicit wealth. Gideon did not accept the narrative. His federal training overrode his familial deference. He recognized an interrogation tactic. He recognized a coordinated psychological attack. He dropped his knife. The heavy silver clattered sharply against the fine china. "Do not speak about my wife that way," Gideon said. His voice dropped an octave, hitting the lethal, flat tone he utilized in federal holding cells. He shifted his gaze from Sylvia to Trent, his eyes narrowing. "If Claire saw a discrepancy in your books, Trent, it is because you handed her a disaster. She does not make things up." Trent's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The veins in his neck bulged. He gripped the edge of the table, abandoning his relaxed posture. "She is a liability, Gideon. She is seeing things that are not there." Gideon braced his hands on the table. He prepared to stand. He prepared to verbally dismantle his brother and tear the dining room apart to defend my honor. I reached under the heavy damask tablecloth. I placed my hand flat over Gideon's knee. I dug my fingers into the muscle of his thigh. I squeezed hard. It was a silent, absolute command: stand down. Gideon froze. He looked at me, confusion warring with his protective, escalating fury. He wanted to shield me. He wanted to stop the abuse. I kept my face slack. I projected the exact image of a frightened, overwhelmed victim. I needed Gideon seated. I needed Trent to feel victorious. If Gideon escalated the conflict, if he forced an ultimatum, Sylvia would terminate my access to Trent's server immediately. She would change the passwords. She would burn the digital ledgers. I required that server. My encrypted drive held 90% of the syndicate's transaction history. I needed the final 10% to guarantee a federal indictment that neither a corrupt judge nor a high-priced defense attorney could ever fracture. I released Gideon's knee. I lowered my chin toward my chest. I forced my shoulders to round forward, shrinking my physical presence in the chair. "Trent is right," I whispered. I injected a slight, deliberate tremble into my vocal cords. I looked at the tablecloth, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "I am sorry, Gideon. The numbers overwhelmed me. I must have misread the vendor codes. I am just not used to this volume of data. It is too much for me." Silence descended over the dining room. Trent exhaled a long, ragged breath. His shoulders dropped. The mottled red color faded from his cheeks, replaced by a pale, sickly relief. He picked up his bourbon, his hand shaking slightly before he swallowed the remaining liquor in a single gulp. Sylvia patted her chest, exhaling a sigh of deep, performative pity. There, Claire. Admitting you are overwhelmed is the first step. We will not press the issue tonight. Just focus on the domestic receipts. Leave the complex operations to Trent. He knows what he is doing." Fiona rolled her eyes, lifted her wineglass, and reached for the cranberry sauce. The crisis passed. The family returned to their meal. Secure in their dominance, they successfully gaslit the poor, confused tutor in front of her own husband. They put the mouse back in her cage. I picked up my fork and resumed eating my turkey. I chewed methodically. I tasted the rich gravy and the roasted sage. Underneath the table, my hand remained perfectly steady. They won the dinner. They secured their narrative, and in doing so, They left the server doors wide open. My dossier grew thicker by the hour, sealing their fate with every keystroke they allowed me to make. The following Tuesday morning, Gideon strapped his service weapon to his hip, kissed my forehead, and drove his government-issued sedan toward the federal field office. I stood in the doorway and watched his taillights disappear around the corner. The moment the street fell silent, I engaged the deadbolt, lowered the living room blinds, and walked directly to my home office. I retrieved my encrypted drive from its hidden compartment behind the baseboard, plugged it into my laptop, and entered the 32-character decryption key. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale blue glow across my desk. I bypassed the domestic receipts. The physical box Sylvia handed me contained nothing more than the messy, amateurish surface of the operation. I accessed the mirrored image of Trent's master server, diving straight into the international wire logs. I isolated the outgoing transfers, sorting the data by date and destination. My fingers moved across the keyboard in rapid, precise strikes. The offshore architecture materialized on my screen. Trent pushed the illicit cash through a specific, rigid funnel. The funds left his domestic Delaware shell companies and hit a primary receiving account in Nicosia, Cyprus. The money sat in the Mediterranean bank for exactly 48 hours. On the third day, the Cyprus account triggered an automated wire, bouncing the entire sum across the Atlantic into an irrevocable corporate trust managed out of Georgetown in the Cayman Islands. I highlighted the column containing the transfer amounts. Trent never deviated from the formula. Every wire bouncing from Cyprus to the Caribbean measured exactly $250,000. He executed this specific transfer sequence twice a week, moving $2 million every single month. I stared at the rhythmic, unyielding numerical pattern. A cold, heavy weight settled at the base of my spine. The coffee in my mug stopped producing steam. The pattern lacked any originality. Financial syndicates often possess a unique signature, a distinct operational fingerprint that forensic auditors use to categorize and track them. I recognized Trent's fingerprint, but I did not recognize it from my tenure at the Treasury Department. I recognized it from my own kitchen. My mind snapped back to a humid evening in late August of 2010. Gideon had returned home after a brutal, 14-hour shift. He dropped his badge on the kitchen island, pulled a bottle of beer from the refrigerator, and rubbed his bloodshot eyes. I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. He rarely discussed his active cases, adhering strictly to federal clearance protocols, but the exhaustion fractured his discipline that night. "We are chasing a ghost," Gideon had murmured, pressing the cold glass bottle against his forehead. "A distribution syndicate moving products straight through the mid-Atlantic corridor. They wash the revenue fast. It never touches the streets. Our financial analysts spotted the wash cycle. But we cannot locate the domestic node." I had turned the stove down to a simmer. "What does the cycle look like?" Gideon took a long swallow of his beer. "Cyprus to the Caymans, a strict 48-hour hold in Nicosia, followed by $250,000 bursts to Georgetown, twice a week like clockwork. The cartel uses local real estate developers to structure the cash domestically before it hits the wire. We just cannot find the developer." I sat back in my desk chair, the memory replaying with razor-sharp clarity. The numbers on my screen blurred, then snapped back into agonizing focus. $250,000, 48 hours, Cyprus to Georgetown. Trent was not just washing money for a random, anonymous syndicate. He served as the primary domestic node for the exact cartel my husband's federal task force hunted. Gideon spent 60 hours a week tearing apart financial records at the Bureau, desperately searching for the ghost laundering the cash, completely oblivious to the fact that the ghost sat across from him at Sylvia's mahogany dining table every Sunday. I stood up. I paced the length of my office. The scale of the danger shifted instantly from a familial nuisance to a catastrophic federal threat. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation breached Trent's server before I controlled the narrative, the resulting blast radius would obliterate Gideon. The Department of Justice does not believe in coincidences. If a federal task force raids a major cartel money laundering operation and discovers the lead washer is the blood brother of one of their own investigating agents, they draw immediate, unforgiving conclusions. Internal Affairs and the Office of Professional Responsibility would launch a devastating inquisition. They would assume Gideon tipped Trent off. They would assume Gideon protected the family. They would strip him of his badge, freeze his pension, and likely file federal obstruction charges. Gideon would face decades in a federal penitentiary simply by proximity. I stopped pacing. I planted my hands flat on my desk and looked at the glowing monitor. I could not tell him. If I revealed the truth to Gideon, the federal mandatory reporting laws placed him in an impossible bind. If he arrested his own brother, Sylvia would orchestrate a vicious defense, claiming Gideon orchestrated the entire scheme to steal the family wealth. If Gideon recused himself and walked away, the Bureau would still flag the conflict of interest and destroy his career. I had to act alone. I had to build an impenetrable legal firewall between my husband and his bloodline. I sat back down. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp pops breaking the silence of the room, and opened a secure, encrypted tunnel to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network portal. I possessed the exact credentials, the precise bureaucratic vocabulary, and the intimate knowledge of the federal reporting architecture required to bypass the lower-level analysts and put the dossier directly into the hands of the Securities and Exchange Commission directors. I began drafting the suspicious activity reports. I did not summarize. I provided surgical, irrefutable data. I indexed the Delaware employer identification numbers. I listed the specific Cyprus routing prefixes. I matched Trent's domestic cash deposits directly to the $250,000 offshore bursts. Next, I initiated the formal whistleblower protocols. I composed the narrative with cold, clinical detachment. I explicitly named Trent as the sole operator of the domestic structuring node. I named Sylvia as the primary beneficiary of the illicit funds, utilizing her marble home renovation as documented proof of unrecorded cash expenditures. Then, I executed the most critical maneuver of the morning. I dug into Sylvia's estate documents, which she foolishly kept on the same unpartitioned server. She held a revocable family trust, funded entirely by Trent's laundered money. She had listed Gideon as a secondary beneficiary, a standard estate planning move that now acted as a lethal legal tether connecting my husband to cartel assets. I pulled a blank legal document template from my Treasury archives. I drafted a formal, irrevocable renunciation of interest. I utilized my designated power of attorney over our joint marital assets to legally sever Gideon's name from the trust. I backdated the digital signature by 3 weeks, citing a fabricated ethical conflict regarding his federal employment. I filed the renunciation directly with the county clerk's digital registry. I severed the bloodline. If the federal government seized Sylvia's estate, Gideon's name no longer existed on the ledger. He owned nothing. He received nothing. The cartel taint could not touch him. I spent 6 continuous hours compiling the FinCEN filings, the whistleblower disclosures, and the offshore routing maps. I packed the data into a heavily encrypted digital dossier. I did not hit send. I coded a scheduled delivery protocol, holding the transmission in a secure proxy server. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. The afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across my desk. I built the guillotine. I placed Trent's neck squarely beneath the blade. I constructed a reinforced steel wall around Gideon, ensuring the coming slaughter would not splatter a single drop of blood on his badge. I locked my screen, removed the drive, and returned it to the wall compartment. I prepared to make Sylvia and Trent believe they still controlled the narrative, right up until the second the floor collapsed beneath their feet. The escalation from psychological warfare to physical violence occurred on the first Tuesday of December, 2010. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I drove down the interstate, heading toward my scheduled tutoring shift at the community college. A harsh, freezing wind stripped the remaining dead leaves from the oak trees lining the highway. My cell phone vibrated against the passenger seat fabric. I checked the caller identification. The display read the name of our home security monitoring company. I accepted the call. The dispatcher informed me that the Zone 4 perimeter sensor, the glass break detector located in my home office, had triggered an alarm sequence. I did not panic. I did not increase my speed. I engaged my turn signal, exited the interstate, and navigated back toward our neighborhood. I parked my sedan 2 streets over. Leaving the engine off, I walked the remaining distance, keeping to the shadows of the neighboring fence lines, scanning the street for unfamiliar vehicles. The road remained entirely empty. I approached the side of my house. The winter air bit at my exposed cheeks. A jagged hole gaped in the center of the office window. Splinters of tempered glass dusted the frost-covered flower beds below the sill. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house held a deep, unnatural silence. The ambient heat had escaped through the broken window, dropping the interior temperature dramatically. I bypassed the kitchen and walked directly down the hallway to my office. The intruders executed a targeted, chaotic ransacking. They ripped the drawers from my desk, dumping pens, paper clips, and blank legal pads across the hardwood floor. They tore the cushions off the reading chair. They pulled the framed prints from the walls, shattering the glass panels against the baseboards. I stepped over the debris, my focus fixed on the lower shelf of the built-in credenza. A heavy, fireproof steel lockbox usually sat anchored to the bottom shelf. The intruders had used a heavy pry bar to rip the box from its moorings. Deep gouges scarred the wood. The lockbox itself lay discarded in the center of the room, its reinforced lid bent backward. The interior of the box sat completely empty. They took the external hard drive. I stood in the center of the wrecked room. I exhaled a slow, controlled breath, watching the condensation plume in the freezing air. Trent realized the liability I represented. The Thanksgiving gaslighting had failed to entirely neutralize the threat, so he leveraged his syndicate associates to physically erase the problem. He sent local cartel enforcers into the home of a federal agent to extract financial ledgers. The sheer desperation of the maneuver confirmed the absolute fragility of his empire. However, Trent underestimated his opponent. I did not keep federal evidence in a portable lockbox purchased from a hardware store. I kept the true, mirrored servers heavily encrypted on a concealed drive hidden behind a false baseboard plate, a plate currently sitting completely untouched 3 feet to my left. The stolen drive was a decoy. Anticipating a physical escalation, I spent the previous weekend constructing a sacrificial lamb. I loaded the decoy drive with surface-level discrepancies. I highlighted domestic tax errors, missing commercial receipts, and sloppy vendor payouts. I deliberately omitted every single routing number connected to Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. I engineered the data to paint me as a nosy, overzealous amateur accountant attempting to catch her brother-in-law committing petty tax fraud. When Trent plugged that stolen drive into his computer, he would find exactly what he hoped to find: proof that I knew he cheated on his domestic taxes, but absolute confirmation that I remained entirely oblivious to the cartel money laundering operation. He would believe he had successfully eliminated the risk. I turned away from the empty lockbox. I walked to the utility closet, retrieved a heavy bristle broom and a metal dustpan, and returned to the office. I swept the shattered glass into neat, uniform piles. The ceramic grinding of the shards against the hardwood echoed through the empty house. I collected the scattered papers. I righted the desk drawers. I operated with precise, robotic efficiency, restoring order to the chaos without elevating my heart rate above 60 beats per minute. I taped a thick sheet of heavy contractor plastic over the broken window pane, sealing out the winter draft. I controlled the environment. The timeline tightened aggressively. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, mere hours after the syndicate lackeys smashed my window, the front doorbell rang. I walked to the entryway and looked through the peephole. Sylvia stood on the front porch. She wore a tailored wool coat and carried a heavy ceramic casserole dish wrapped in a checkered towel. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her presence struck like a physical blow. She orchestrated a felony, breaking and entering at my home in the morning, and arrived in the afternoon to gloat over the ruins while feigning maternal support. I opened the door. Sylvia's gaze immediately darted to the side of the house, Taking in the heavy black plastic taped over the office window, she pressed her free hand against her chest. She opened her mouth, forming a perfect, hollow circle of manufactured shock. "Claire, darling, good heavens!" Sylvia gasped, her voice pitching upward in artificial panic. "I saw the plastic from the driveway. What on earth happened? Were you robbed?" "Someone broke the office window this morning while I was driving to the college," I said. I stepped back, granting her entry. Sylvia bustled into the foyer, bringing the heavy scent of baked ziti and expensive floral perfume into my home. "Oh, you poor thing. How utterly terrifying. I brought dinner. I had a feeling you might need a hot meal today." I took the casserole dish from her hands. "Thank you. Sylvia, please, come into the kitchen. I will pour some coffee." I carried the dish to the counter. Sylvia followed, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She did not sit at the kitchen island. Instead, she paced near the archway that led toward the hallway offering a direct line of sight into my office. I turned my back to her, retrieving 2 mugs from the cabinet. I poured the dark roast coffee. I did not tremble. I did not drop the ceramic. I turned around and handed her a mug. Sylvia gripped the warm ceramic. Her eyes drifted over my shoulder, peering down the hall. She stretched her neck slightly, seeking visual confirmation of the wreckage. She looked for the credenza. She looked for the lockbox. I watched her pupils dilate. I watched the microscopic relaxation of her shoulders as she registered the empty space on the bottom shelf. She confirmed the theft. She confirmed her complicity. "Did they take anything valuable?" Sylvia asked, taking a slow sip of her coffee. She arranged her features into a mask of deep sympathy, but a sharp, eager glint illuminated her eyes. She hunted for my devastation. "Jewelry. Electronics. Trent's files." I leaned against the kitchen counter. I picked up a glass of sparkling water. "They ransacked the desk," I said, keeping my voice low, injecting a hollow, defeated cadence into my delivery. "They broke into the lockbox. I kept a backup hard drive in there. It had all of my lesson plans for the college, and the ledger copies Trent gave me. It is all gone." Sylvia sighed, a long dramatic exhalation. She reached out and patted my forearm. "Material things can be replaced. Claire, the important thing is that you are not home. The neighborhood is just getting so unsafe. You must be absolutely terrified." I looked into her eyes. The psychological pressure in the kitchen compressed, heavy and suffocating. She stood in my home, drinking my coffee, actively probing the wound she authorized her cartel associates to inflict. I did not confront her. I did not throw the coffee in her face. I did not mention the Cyprus accounts or the federal whistleblower reports sitting safely in my hidden compartment. I simply took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water. "I feel very vulnerable," I whispered, feeding her the exact emotion she desperately craved. Sylvia offered a warm, victorious smile. "Gideon will install a better alarm. We will take care of you, Claire. Family protects family." She finished her coffee and departed 10 minutes later, leaving her casserole on my counter. She walked out the front door believing she had successfully disarmed me. She believed she had stripped me of my evidence and relegated me back to the role of the frightened, helpless subordinate. I locked the deadbolt behind her. I stood in the silent foyer, listening to her engine roar to life in my driveway. I allowed her to claim the afternoon victory, fully aware that her arrogant, invasive visit provided the final psychological justification I needed to orchestrate her absolute destruction. The mail carrier dropped a heavy, cream-colored envelope into our steel mailbox on the second Thursday of December 2010. By the time I pulled the cardstock from the metal slot, Trent had already digested the stolen drive. I knew this because I embedded a silent tracking pixel in the root directory of the decoy files. 2 days after the break-in, a remote server pinged my laptop, logging an Internet Protocol address registered directly to Trent's commercial real estate office. The pixel tracked his keystrokes. I watched his cursor move through the fabricated folders. He opened the domestic tax files, lingered on the falsified deductions, and searched the entire drive for offshore terminology. He found absolutely zero references to Cyprus or the Cayman Islands. The syndicate exhaled. They believed they possessed my entire investigative footprint. They believed I simply chased minor tax evasion. Sylvia's envelope arrived sealed with thick gold wax. I broke the crest and extracted a formal invitation to the annual family reunion, scheduled for the upcoming Saturday evening. A handwritten note on personalized stationery slipped from between the folds. Claire, the break-in must have shaken you terribly. Come, let the family surround you. A healing evening. We must mend fences and stick together. I traced the embossed lettering with my index finger. Predators do not invite wounded prey to healing circles. They construct arenas. Sylvia intended to isolate me in her environment, surrounded entirely by her loyalists. She needed to evaluate my psychological state post-burglary, aiming to enforce my continued silence through sheer numerical intimidation and veiled threats. She framed the ambush as a gesture of maternal grace. Gideon returned from the federal field office at 6 o'clock. He read the handwritten note, crumpled the heavy paper in his fist, and dropped it directly into the kitchen trash can. "We are not going," he stated. He unbuckled his leather service holster, placing the heavy firearm on the top shelf of the pantry. He kept his back to me, gripping the edge of the counter. The atmosphere at Thanksgiving bordered on toxic. "I will not let them subject you to another interrogation, especially after someone just put a brick through our window." I retrieved the crumpled note from the bin. I smoothed the creases against the granite island. "We are going," I replied. Gideon turned around. He searched my face, scanning for the tremble, the fear, the exhaustion. He found a blank, placid surface. "Claire, they hate you," he said, his voice dropping, heavy with fatigue. "Trent mocks you. My mother uses you as a prop. You do not have to subject yourself to their abuse to prove a point. Refusing the invitation proves they intimidated us," I said, folding the note. "Attending proves we have nothing to hide. It shuts down the narrative. I will sit in the corner, drink sparkling water, and leave after 2 hours. We contain the situation." Gideon stared at me. He recognized the logic. Even as his protective instincts rebelled against it, he relented, shaking his head, and walked toward the bedroom to change out of his suit. I needed them in one room. I required their physical containment while the bureaucratic machinery engaged. If the federal hammer fell while Trent sat in his office or Sylvia shopped downtown, they would scatter. They would shred documents, wipe servers, and flee before the arrest warrants cleared a judge's desk. I needed them anchored geographically, distracted by their own arrogance, completely oblivious to the incoming strike. I spent the next 48 hours finalizing the execution. I sat in my freezing office, the winter wind rattling the heavy plastic taped over the broken window pane. I pulled the true, encrypted drive from the wall compartment. I assembled the final data packets. I attached the unredacted digital ledgers, the Cyprus routing sequences, the Delaware Shell Company identification numbers, and Sylvia's trust documents. I linked the $250,000 offshore bursts directly to the cash deposit timestamps at Trent's local bank branches. I packaged the financial evidence with a sworn, notarized whistleblower affidavit, utilizing my former federal credentials to guarantee immediate, high-priority review. I addressed the first transmission to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, flagging the accounts for an immediate civil asset freeze. I addressed the second transmission directly to the Cyber Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, specifically bypassing Gideon's local task force commanders to prevent any internal interception or bureaucratic delay. I did not press send. I routed the packets through a secure offshore proxy server, establishing a time-delayed release protocol. I coded the script with mechanical precision. I keyed in the exact execution parameters. The servers would hold the emails in a digital vault, waiting for the designated trigger. I set the transmission to launch at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening on Saturday. The administrative guillotine hung suspended by a digital thread, entirely out of my hands. No one could stop the countdown. I logged off, closed the laptop, and slid the drive back into the hidden compartment. I replaced the baseboard, stood up, and prepared to walk directly into their trap. The sun dropped behind the Virginia tree line on the second Saturday of December 2010, stripping the warmth from the afternoon air. I stood before the full-length mirror in our bedroom, constructing my armor. I did not choose Kevlar or steel. I chose the precise aesthetic of a broken, defeated woman. I pulled a charcoal gray knit dress from its hanger. The wool hung heavy and shapeless, swallowing my frame. Engineered to make my shoulders appear rounded and narrow, I bypassed the structured heels I wore during my tenure at the Treasury, sliding my feet into flat, sensible loafers with scuffed leather toes. I brushed my hair straight back, securing it with a rigid plastic clip, exposing the pale skin of my neck. I washed all trace of color from my face, applying a light dusting of translucent powder to drain the life from my complexion. I stared at my reflection. The woman in the glass looked exhausted, hollowed out by the stress of a recent home invasion, perfectly aligned with the narrative Sylvia and Trent demanded. I built a physical manifestation of a highly vulnerable target. I walked to the bed, picking up my black leather handbag. I laid a single, unmarked manila folder on the mattress. The contents of the folder weighed less than 3 ounces, yet possessed the bureaucratic density to crush a multi-million-dollar cartel operation. I ran my fingertips over the top sheet. It bore the stark, official header of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The page contained the encrypted proxy server transmission receipts, verifying that the unredacted digital ledgers, the Cyprus routing sequences, and the Delaware Shell Company identification numbers sat securely in the federal staging queue. Beneath the receipts lay the notarized trust voidance documents. The heavy county clerk stamp inked the bottom corner, providing absolute legal confirmation that I successfully severed Gideon's name from Sylvia's illicit estate. I aligned the edges of the paper, pressed the documents into the folder, and slipped the folder into the center divider of my purse. I pulled the heavy brass zipper shut. The administrative execution rested against my ribs. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of cold water, visualizing the tactical reality of the upcoming evening. Trent deployed local syndicate enforcers to extract the financial ledgers from my home on Tuesday morning. The extraction failed. Cartels operate on a foundation of absolute risk elimination. They do not tolerate loose ends. And Trent's handlers possessed a zero-tolerance policy for domestic liabilities. The Thanksgiving gaslighting established a convenient public narrative regarding my declining mental stability. The break-in elevated my documented psychological stress levels. The family reunion provided the final, contained arena. They intended to permanently silence the liability tonight. They would not utilize a firearm or a blade. A violent attack at a crowded family gathering demands a massive homicide investigation, forensic teams, and immediate federal scrutiny. They required a clean erasure, a death that the local medical examiner would classify as a tragic, natural medical event. During my decade investigating corporate syndicates, I audited the procurement logs of cartel medical suppliers. I understood their preferred methodology for untraceable eliminations. They utilized a specialized, highly concentrated beta-blocker derivative, originally synthesized for severe cardiac trauma, but diverted into the black market. The liquid possessed no odor, no color, and no distinct chemical taste. A single milliliter, dropped into a cold beverage with melting ice, aggressively binds to the beta-adrenergic receptors in the human heart. The chemical drops the heart rate from a normal resting pace to 20 beats per minute within 60 seconds. The resulting catastrophic hypotension triggers an immediate, fatal cardiac arrhythmia. The victim gasps for air, clutches their chest, and collapses. To a responding paramedic, and subsequently to a county coroner, the victim appears to have suffered a massive, fatal panic attack leading to sudden cardiac arrest, given the documented trauma of my recent home invasion. A medical examiner would attribute the failure of my heart directly to acute psychological stress. No toxicology screen tests for the obscure beta-blocker derivative unless the coroner specifically knows to hunt for it. A perfect, invisible murder. I did not pray for safety, I engineered it. 48 hours prior to the party, I requisitioned a specific chemical reactant from a former forensic contact in Washington. I held the testing strip between my thumb and index finger. It consisted of a porous polymer film, measuring exactly 1 inch long and 1/4 inch wide, resembling a sliver of translucent tape. The film contained a highly sensitive chemical reagent designed to shift from clear to a vivid, undeniable crimson upon contact with the synthetic beta-blocker compound. I folded the top edge of the thin strip. I slid the polymer under the left cuff of my wool sleeve. The material rested flush against the skin of my wrist, completely invisible to the room, but instantly accessible to my right hand. I looked at the digital clock glowing on the microwave display. 6 o'clock in the evening. I reviewed the automated transmission protocol in my mind, locking the sequence into my active memory. The proxy servers currently held the encrypted evidence in a digital vault. I programmed the execution script with mechanical, unyielding precision. At exactly 8 o'clock tonight, the script would bypass the staging area firewalls. The data packets would strike the primary intake servers at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Cyber Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation simultaneously. The automated algorithms within the federal mainframes would instantly read the flagged Cyprus and Cayman routing codes. Within seconds of receipt, automated federal holds would lock the Delaware Shell Company accounts, freezing Trent's domestic liquid capital. No human intervention could halt the sequence. No high-priced defense attorney could file an injunction fast enough to stop the algorithmic asset seizure. Gideon walked into the kitchen, pulling at the collar of his suit jacket. He stopped, taking in my pale face, the oversized gray wool, and my rigid posture. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing against the bone. "We do not have to do this, Claire," he said, his voice dropping to a low, protective register. "You look exhausted. You look like you are barely holding together. I will call Sylvia and tell her you are unwell. Let them have their party without us." I picked up my leather handbag and slung the strap over my shoulder. I projected quiet resignation, offering a weak, trembling smile. "I just want to get it over with, Gideon," I whispered. "If we stay home, Sylvia will just drop by unannounced again to check on me. I will sit quietly, eat a plate of food, and we can leave early." He stared at me, warring between his desire to shield me from his family and his understanding of my logic. He exhaled a sharp breath, nodded once, and led the way to the garage. We drove his government-issued sedan through the freezing December night. The heater blasted dry, hot air against my shins. Carrying the faint scent of engine oil and dust, the tires hummed against the asphalt. We drove for 40 minutes, navigating away from our modest subdivision and entering the sprawling, gated communities of the elite suburbs. We turned onto Sylvia's street. The massive oak trees lining the avenue gave way to an expansive, illuminated estate. We pulled into the driveway. The paving consisted of imported European cobblestone, a 1/4 acre of custom masonry financed entirely by the cartel revenue flowing through Trent's Delaware Shell accounts. Luxury sedans and heavy, modified sports utility vehicles packed the perimeter of the circular drive. Warm, golden light spilled from the massive bay windows of the 2-story brick colonial, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered manicured lawn. I sat in the passenger seat as Gideon shifted the sedan into park. The coiled spring inside my chest compressed to its absolute maximum limit. The tension wound so tightly it bordered on physical pain. Every sneer, every insult regarding my salary, every ruined coat, every falsified ledger, and every shattered window converged on this exact geographical point. They brought the entire weight of a criminal syndicate down upon my head, expecting me to shatter under the pressure. I stepped out of the car. The freezing December wind hit my face, biting into my exposed skin. I pulled my handbag tightly against my side, securing the folder containing their bureaucratic execution. I tapped my left wrist, verifying the stiff polymer strip remained hidden in the fabric of my sleeve. I waited for Gideon to round the hood of the car, took his offered arm, and walked toward the heavy oak front doors, preparing to dismantle their empire. We stepped through the heavy oak double doors. A hired attendant in a crisp black vest immediately approached, extending his arms to take our coats. Gideon handed over his wool trench coat. I slipped out of my heavy winter parka, revealing the shapeless charcoal knit dress beneath it. The heat of the house washed over me, thick with the scent of roasted garlic and expensive pine garlands. Sylvia's living room spanned the entire rear elevation of the property. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels framed a frost-covered terrace, keeping the freezing December night at bay. The space vibrated with the overlapping conversations of 40 extended relatives and business associates. A string quartet played softly from a raised dais in the corner, their music completely drowned out by the volume of the crowd. I did not focus on the faces. I engaged my spatial mapping protocols. I stood on the edge of the foyer and counted the primary egress points, the front double doors behind me, the terrace sliders directly ahead. A swinging wooden door leading to the catering kitchen on my left, a narrow hallway leading to the guest suites on my right. I catalogued the sightlines. The central chandelier cast a harsh, brilliant light across the open floor plan, eliminating shadows. I located a tactical position near a heavy marble structural pillar. I walked toward it, securing my back against the solid architecture. Sylvia cut a path through the center of the room. She wore an emerald silk gown that dragged slightly against the imported Persian rugs. She did not look at her guests. She scanned the room for imperfections. She snapped her fingers at a server balancing a silver tray of seared scallops, pointing a sharp, manicured fingernail toward the fireplace. The young server nodded frantically, reversed his course, and practically ran toward the hearth. Sylvia pivoted, finally registering my presence by the pillar. She marched across the floorboards, stopping inches from my space. Her eyes swept up and down my oversized dress, pausing deliberately on my scuffed leather loafers. "Claire," Sylvia announced, her voice pitched to ensure the surrounding guests heard the condescension. "You actually came. After your little panic attack regarding the broken window, I assumed you would stay buried under your blankets. You look entirely washed out. Go find the bartender. Ask for a glass of tap water." I looked directly into her eyes. I did not shift my weight. "Thank you for the suggestion, Sylvia," I replied. My vocal cords remained entirely relaxed. Gideon stepped up beside me. He clamped a heavy hand onto my shoulder. He glared at his mother, the muscles in his neck tightening. "She looks fine, Mother. Back off." Sylvia merely smiled, a thin, patronizing curve of her lips, and glided away to reprimand another caterer regarding the temperature of the champagne flutes. I shifted my gaze toward the raised stone hearth of the fireplace. Trent held court. He wore a bespoke three-piece suit tailored from midnight blue worsted wool. He gripped a heavy, faceted crystal tumbler, swirling the amber liquid inside. 3 older men, local municipal officials judging by their stiff posture and sycophantic nods, formed a tight semicircle around him. I tuned my auditory focus to Trent's frequency, isolating his voice from the ambient noise of the party. Clearing the final zoning permits next week," Trent boasted. His chest puffed forward. "A $10 million commercial acquisition. We intend to anchor the block. Retail space on the ground floor, luxury residential lofts above. It requires heavy upfront capital, but the returns map out perfectly over a 5-year projection." He leaned back, hooking his free thumb into the pocket of his tailored vest. He delivered the performance flawlessly. I stared at the man bragging about a $10 million commercial acquisition. My brain stripped away the midnight blue wool and the crystal tumbler. I translated his words back into the raw, unredacted federal data sitting on my encrypted drive. I knew the exact parcel of land he referenced. It consisted of a contaminated industrial lot on the edge of the county lines. He possessed no zoning permits. He held no architectural blueprints. He utilized the land purely as a localized shell, a fictitious asset designed to justify the massive influx of offshore capital. The $10 million did not represent investment revenue. It represented the quarterly wash quota assigned to him by a narcotics syndicate. Fiona stood a few feet away from her husband. She extended her left wrist toward a group of female cousins. The recessed overhead lighting caught the massive stones set into her diamond tennis bracelet. She rotated her forearm slowly, ensuring every facet reflected the glare directly into the eyes of her audience. "Trent commissioned it for our anniversary," Fiona stated, her voice dripping with artificial modesty. "He insisted on a custom platinum setting. I told him it was too much. But you know how he gets when he wants to spoil me?" I analyzed the jewelry. The diamonds did not represent a husband's affection. They represented thousands of structured cash deposits routed through Cyprus. They represented blood. Every single expensive prop in this arena, the imported cobblestone driveway, the emerald silk gown, the silver trays of seared scallops. The string quartet existed solely because men in distant countries murdered their rivals to control distribution supply chains. Fiona dropped her wrist and wove through the guests. She stopped directly in front of my marble pillar. She looked at my pale, powdered face. "Claire, are you sure you should be here? You look like you might faint. I suppose the stress of your little community college job finally caught up with you." I met her gaze. I did not blink. "I am perfectly fine, Fiona." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a harsh, mocking whisper. "You really should try to dress up for these events. You make Gideon look like he married the hired help." Gideon stepped forward, his jaw tight, his hand dropping instinctively toward his waist where his service holster usually rested. I extended my left arm, pressing my palm flat against his chest. I felt the rapid, heavy thud of his heart through his suit jacket. His federal instincts twitched, registering the coordinated hostility in the room, even if he did not yet understand the lethal intent behind it. I silenced him with a single, sharp look. I turned back to Fiona. "I prefer the comfort of this dress," I stated evenly. I kept my breathing locked at 60 beats per minute. Fiona smirked, victorious, and walked away to display her cartel-funded diamonds to another group of relatives. They circled me. They delivered their passive-aggressive insults. They believed they held absolute dominance over the environment because they owned the floorboards beneath our feet. They felt the impenetrable armor of their stolen wealth. They looked at my dull, shapeless dress and my expressionless face and concluded they had completely shattered my spirit. I stood against the marble pillar and surveyed the room. The psychological vice clamped down, squeezing the breath from the air. But I did not feel intimidated. I felt the cold, mechanical anticipation of an executioner checking her watch. The automated electronic transmission waited silently in the offshore proxy server. I looked at Trent laughing loudly by the fire. I looked at Sylvia berating a waiter over the placement of the caviar. I looked at Fiona polishing her diamonds with a cocktail napkin. I did not look at a powerful, untouchable dynasty. I observed them with the detached, quiet patience of a warden walking a cell block. They strutted across the imported rugs, raising their glasses, boasting about their millions, entirely oblivious to the absolute certainty that the prison doors had already been locked from the outside. The grandfather clock in the central hallway struck the hour. 8 o'clock in the evening. I maintained my position against the structural marble pillar. Gideon stood 3 feet to my right, intercepted by a distant uncle who insisted on recounting a lengthy golf-related anecdote. Gideon nodded politely, his back angled slightly toward the room, his attention temporarily anchored by familial obligation. His diversion isolated me entirely. Sylvia abandoned her position near the terrace doors. She cut a path across the room, intercepting a young caterer carrying a heavy silver tray of mixed beverages. She did not issue a verbal command. She simply reached out and physically lifted a single crystal highball glass from the center of the tray. She dismissed the young man with a sharp flick of her manicured wrist. The ambient noise of the party began to warp. The overlapping conversations, the clinking silverware, the bright cello notes from the string quartet. The sound stretched, distorting into a low, continuous drone. My auditory cortex filtered out the useless data, isolating the precise rhythm of Sylvia's heels striking the hardwood floor. She marched directly toward my pillar. She stopped inches from my shoes. She extended her right arm, presenting the glass. "You look parched, Claire," Sylvia murmured. She layered her voice with a thick, suffocating veneer of maternal care. "I noticed you have not visited the bar. I had the catering staff prepare your usual beverage. Sparkling water, a wedge of lime, no ice, just the way you prefer it." I reached out. My fingers wrapped around the heavy, faceted crystal. The glass felt ice cold against my skin. Condensation beaded along the surface, catching the harsh light from the chandelier overhead. I did not lift the rim to my mouth. I held the beverage at chest level and expanded my visual perimeter, analyzing the shifting dynamics of the room. Trent stood 15 feet away by the stone hearth. He no longer discussed municipal zoning permits. He abandoned his captive audience of local officials. He planted his feet shoulder-width apart, gripping his own tumbler. His unblinking gaze locked entirely on my face. Fiona stood near the catering kitchen doors. She dropped her arm. The diamond tennis bracelet disappeared into the folds of her designer dress. She mirrored her husband's rigid, predatory posture, staring directly at the crystal glass in my hand. They stopped performing their wealth. They stopped pretending to care about the party. The entire syndicate hierarchy anchored their collective attention to a single, 8-ounce serving of sparkling water. I required absolute chemical verification. I held my black leather handbag under my left arm. I shifted my weight deliberately, allowing the strap to slide off my shoulder. As I caught the heavy leather bag with my right hand, a folded white linen cocktail napkin slipped from my grasp. It fluttered downward, landing directly on the toe of my scuffed loafer. I bent my knees. I kept my spine perfectly vertical, dropping into a smooth, controlled crouch. Sylvia looked down at me, her emerald silk gown rustling against the floorboards. The movement effectively shielded my hands from the rest of the room. I shifted the crystal glass entirely to my left hand. My right thumb and index finger darted beneath the wool cuff of my left sleeve. I extracted the porous polymer testing strip. I did not hesitate. I pressed the edge of the strip directly against the heavy condensation pooling near the rim of the glass, dragging the polymer briefly across the damp crystal where the liquid had sloshed against the side. I palmed the strip, concealing it against the curve of my fingers. I picked up the linen napkin and stood back up. I lowered my gaze, pretending to inspect the white fabric for lint. I shifted my palm, exposing the polymer strip to my direct line of sight for a fraction of a second. The chemical reagent reacted with absolute, violent certainty. The translucent film no longer resembled clear tape. It flushed a vivid, undeniable crimson, the dark, heavy color of arterial blood. The reaction confirmed the presence of the synthetic beta-blocker derivative, a fatal cardiac accelerant. The dosage suspended in the sparkling water held enough concentrated potency to drop a resting human heart rate to 0 within 60 seconds. The liquid represented an invisible, untraceable bullet. My autonomic nervous system registered the lethal threat. My adrenal glands attempted to flood my bloodstream with survival hormones. I locked the physiological response down immediately. I inhaled through my nose. 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. I forced my heart to maintain its steady, unyielding 60 beats per minute. I pushed the crimson strip back beneath my wool cuff, securing the physical evidence entirely out of sight. I lifted my chin and looked directly into Sylvia's eyes. Sylvia smiled. The expression carried no malice, no sharp edges, no theatrical villainy. She looked upon me with the serene, peaceful satisfaction of a woman watching a tedious problem solve itself. "Drink up, darling," Sylvia whispered, her voice soothing and low. "You need to stay hydrated. It is so dreadfully warm in here." I held my own execution method. The immense weight of the crystal grounded my feet to the floorboards. I shifted my eyes toward the fireplace. Trent raised his left arm. He pulled back the tailored cuff of his bespoke midnight blue suit jacket, exposing the heavy platinum chronograph secured to his wrist. He stared at the dial. He tracked the sweeping second hand. He initiated the countdown, waiting for me to swallow the lethal dose, calculating the exact moment my heart would fail and my body would collapse onto the imported Persian rugs. Fiona leaned forward, her lips parted slightly, her breathing shallow with eager, barely contained anticipation. The psychological compression crushed the oxygen from the immediate atmosphere. The air grew thick, heavy with the localized, collective intent to commit murder in a crowded, brightly lit room. The contrast defied sanity. A string quartet played classical music, waiters circulated with silver platters of seared scallops, and three wealthy, impeccably dressed individuals coordinated an assassination right in the center of a family reunion. They surrounded me with warm, reassuring smiles. They offered me water. They waited for me to die. I held the glass. The condensation gathered near the rim and dripped a single, freezing bead of water onto my knuckles. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not lift the rim to my lips. I simply let the seconds tick by, staring back at them, allowing the syndicate to bask in their perceived absolute victory for one final, unbroken minute before the floor collapsed. I stood motionless against the cold stone of the structural pillar, holding the lethal crystal glass, and I watched my husband wake up. Federal training rewires the human brain. It systematically strips away the instinct to trust the surrounding environment and replaces that instinct with a constant, humming metric of threat assessment. Gideon spent years hunting violent syndicates, learning to read the microscopic shifts in human physiology that betray criminal intent. For a decade, a heavy, impenetrable blindfold of familial loyalty prevented him from applying those interrogation metrics to his own mother and brother. That blindfold disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Uncle Vernon, a retired orthodontist smelling heavily of bay rum aftershave, stood 3 feet away from Gideon, trapping him in a monotonous monologue regarding a recent golf tournament. Gideon nodded politely, offering the required social cues. But I observed his eyes. They did not focus on Uncle Vernon's face. They swept the perimeter of the room in a rhythmic, left-to-right visual pan, cataloging the baseline behaviors of the 40 guests occupying the space. Gideon registered the first anomaly instantly. Trent operated as an acoustic weapon. He possessed a desperate psychological need to dominate the airspace of any room he entered, ensuring his voice carried over the ambient noise. When Trent stopped speaking, he left a vacuum. Gideon's visual sweep snapped toward the fireplace, instantly locating the source of the silence. He found his brother standing rigidly by the stone hearth. Trent did not hold a conversation. He did not drink his bourbon. His jaw clamped shut, the masseter muscles bulging against his cheek. He stared fixedly across the room with the unblinking, hyper-focused intensity of a predator tracking a wounded animal. Gideon followed the vector of Trent's gaze. The invisible line intersected the room and terminated directly at the glass in my hand. Gideon frowned. He shifted his weight, his federal instincts snagging on the abnormal behavior. He expanded his visual search, looking for secondary confirmation of the anomaly. He found Fiona near the catering doors. She no longer displayed her cartel-funded diamonds to her cousins. She stood perfectly still, ignoring the women surrounding her. Her neck craned forward, her gaze mirrored her husband's exact trajectory, anchored entirely to my left hand. Finally, Gideon looked down. He looked at the woman standing inches from my shoes. Sylvia never stood still. She operated in a state of perpetual, aggressive motion, adjusting floral arrangements, berating staff, and micromanaging the aesthetic of her domain. Now, she stood locked in place, her emerald silk gown perfectly motionless against the floorboards. She stared at my hands. The cognitive dissonance fractured, the illusion of the family reunion dissolved. Gideon processed the incoming data. 3 apex predators of the family hierarchy abandoned their baseline social behaviors simultaneously. They triangulated their focus onto a single, isolated target. They executed a coordinated, hyper-vigilant observation of a specific object. He saw Trent lift his left arm, expose the heavy platinum chronograph, and track the sweeping second hand. Gideon did not know about the Cyprus routing accounts. He did not know about the Delaware shell companies or the offshore corporate trusts. He did not know that a highly concentrated beta-blocker derivative currently saturated the sparkling water sweating against my palm. But he knew intent. He recognized the physiological markers of individuals waiting for a trap to spring. The husband who helped me plant backyard tomatoes and bought me coffee disappeared entirely. The FBI special agent emerged. Gideon cut off Uncle Vernon mid-sentence. He moved with the sudden, explosive speed of a trained operator neutralizing a threat. He closed the 3-foot gap separating us in a single, fluid stride. He did not bump into Sylvia. He did not jostle my arm. He reached across the space and snatched the crystal highball glass directly from my fingers. "Don't touch anything else," Gideon whispered. His voice lacked any warmth, stripped down to the flat, mechanical tone he used for field operations. I looked up at him. I watched his pulse hammer against the line of his jaw. The veins in his neck pulled taut like industrial cables. He held the glass away from his body, angling his wrist to avoid spilling a single drop of the liquid onto his skin. He did not need to smell the water or test the chemical composition. He looked at Trent. Trent recoiled. The sudden intervention shattered his countdown. The blood drained from Trent's face, leaving the skin an ashen, sickly gray. He took a stumbling step backward, his shoulder blades hitting the heavy stone of the fireplace mantel. Gideon looked at his mother. Sylvia's mask of serene maternal satisfaction collapsed, her eyes widened, the pupils contracting into tight pinpricks of absolute terror. She opened her mouth, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. Gideon evaluated their immediate physiological collapse. Guilt radiated from their pores. The sheer, unadulterated panic flooding their faces confirmed his hypothesis. They handed me a lethal payload, and the federal agent intercepted it. The ensuing 60 seconds redefined the architecture of the room. Gideon recognized an active, lethal threat targeting his wife within a confined space. He did not view the surrounding individuals as relatives. He categorized them as hostile actors in an unsecured perimeter. He acted. Gideon swept the right panel of his suit jacket backward, clearing the fabric from his waistline. His palm locked around the textured polymer grip of the compact sidearm he carried secured in his inside-the-waistband holster. He drew the weapon. The sharp, mechanical scrape of Kydex-releasing steel sliced through the ambient noise. 1 minute later, the chatter of 30 relatives died instantly. A young caterer carrying a silver tray of empty champagne flutes froze, his hands trembling. The tray slipped from his fingers. The heavy silver crashed against the hardwood floor. The delicate crystal shattered into hundreds of brilliant shards, the sound detonating like a gunshot in the sudden vacuum of the room. The string quartet stopped mid-measure, the cellist's bow dragging a harsh, discordant shriek across the strings. The guests scattered. Aunts, uncles, and municipal officials shoved backward, pressing their spines against the walls and the terrace glass, clearing a wide, empty circle in the exact center of the floor. They stared at the firearm, their faces twisted in shock and confusion. Gideon ignored the crowd. He established a tactical bubble around my position. He squared his shoulders, expanding his physical footprint to assert absolute dominance over the immediate airspace. He drew his service weapon, angled the barrel downward toward the floorboards to maintain strict trigger discipline, and stepped directly between me and his mother. He looked at his own family with eyes I had never seen in our home. The warmth, the patience, and the lifelong loyalty vanished, replaced by chips of flat, unreflective obsidian. "Who exactly gave my wife that glass?" Gideon demanded. The volume of his voice did not shatter glass, but the cold, lethal weight of the question anchored every person in the room to the floor. Nobody moved. Sylvia's hand shook violently. The champagne flute she held hovered inches from her mouth, the golden liquid sloshing over the crystal rim and dripping onto the bodice of her emerald gown. Trent froze with a cocktail napkin half folded in his hands, pressing himself flat against the stones of the hearth. Seeking an escape route that did not exist, Fiona pressed a hand to her throat. backing slowly toward the catering doors until her shoulder blades hit the heavy wood. The psychological compression reached its absolute zenith. The syndicate planned an invisible assassination, relying on the cover of a crowded social gathering to mask their execution. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the center of their own performative arena, staring down the barrel of a federal agent's weapon. The family reunion transformed instantly into a federal crime scene, and the silence reigning over the room confirmed their absolute guilt. The silence in the room stretched, brittle and sharp. Gideon held the compact sidearm steady. He dominated the airspace, projecting absolute kinetic violence. The guests pressed themselves into the shadows, expecting gunfire. The scent of spilled champagne and roasting meats hung heavy in the air, suddenly cloying and foul. I did not scream. I did not cower behind my husband's broad shoulders. I did not succumb to the adrenaline flooding my system. The physical threat no longer existed. The syndicate had fired their single, invisible bullet, and I had caught it. I stepped forward, moving out from the protective shadow of the structural marble pillar. I closed the distance between Gideon and myself, stepping directly into his line of fire. I extended my left hand. I placed my palm directly over his knuckles, covering the rigid grip he maintained on the polymer frame of the weapon. He flinched, his federal training fighting the interference, but he recognized the tactile pressure of my fingers. He shifted his gaze from his mother to my face, his chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. His eyes searched mine, hunting for panic, searching for the terrified victim his family desperately wanted me to be. He found only the cold, unyielding surface of a frozen lake. I applied a slow, steady downward pressure against his hands. I did not speak. I communicated the command entirely through leverage. Physical force is no longer required. Gideon resisted for a fraction of a second, his protective fury demanding a violent outlet. Then exhaled a harsh, ragged breath. He surrendered to my calm. He allowed me to guide the barrel of the weapon downward until the muzzle pointed directly at the oak floorboards. He did not reholster the firearm, keeping his finger indexed safely along the slide, maintaining his tactical perimeter, but he yielded the floor to me. I turned my back to the weapon. I walked toward the center of the living room, stepping onto the imported Persian rug. The 40 guests held their collective breath, watching the drab, oversized charcoal wool of my dress move through their glittering, cartel-funded arena. They looked at me as if I had risen from a coffin. I reached into my black leather handbag. The brass zipper scraped loudly in the silent room. I grasped the edge of the unmarked manila folder and pulled it free. I stopped in front of the heavy, glass-topped coffee table situated between the plush leather sofas. I extended my arm and dropped the folder onto the glass surface. The thick stack of federal documents landed with a flat, heavy thud. The sound reverberated through the vast space like a gavel striking a wooden block, finalizing a verdict. I turned to face Sylvia. She remained rooted to the floorboards, the spilled champagne soaking into the bodice of her emerald silk gown, turning the fabric black. Her manicured hands trembled uncontrollably. I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject anger, vindictiveness, or triumph into my vocal cords. I maintained a conversational, utterly steady volume, employing the exact cadence I utilized when explaining basic ledger entries to my community college students. I did not drink the water, Sylvia, I stated. She blinked, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. Claire, I do not understand. I reached beneath the cuff of my left wool sleeve. My fingers located the stiff polymer testing strip. I extracted it, holding it up, pinching the material between my thumb and index finger. I exposed the vivid, crimson reaction to the harsh chandelier light overhead. I tested the condensation on the rim of the glass before you even stepped away, I explained, keeping my tone strictly academic, dissecting her assassination attempt like a laboratory specimen. The chemical reagent confirmed the presence of a highly concentrated synthetic beta blocker derivative, a compound specifically designed to bind to the adrenergic receptors and induce catastrophic hypotension and fatal cardiac arrhythmia within 60 seconds of ingestion. You plan to execute me right here, in the middle of your living room, and allow the county coroner to classify my death as a severe panic attack brought on by the trauma of a home invasion. Sylvia's mouth opened and closed. She looked at the crimson strip, then at the heavy crystal glass Gideon still held away from his body. The realization that her invisible murder weapon now constituted highly secured federal physical evidence severed the last remaining threads of her composure. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, suffocating a ragged, wet gasp. I dismissed her entirely. She represented merely a parasite feeding off the host. I shifted my focus to the stone hearth, targeting the architect. Trent stood paralyzed against the mantel. The arrogant, posturing real estate developer vanished completely, replaced by a cornered animal realizing the steel jaws of a trap had just snapped shut around his leg. I closed the distance, stopping exactly 6 feet from his position. You assumed handing your unredacted receipts to a community college tutor provided you with a naive, disposable human shield, I said, locking my eyes onto his pale, sweating face. You assumed my silence at the Thanksgiving dinner table confirmed my total incompetence. You calculated the risk and determined I represented nothing more than a minor domestic tax liability. Trent swallowed hard, the tendons in his neck strained against the collar of his bespoke midnight blue suit. Cyprus routing prefix 0049, I recited, pulling the numbers effortlessly from my eidetic memory, projecting them into the silent room. Cayman Islands Offshore Trust Identification 77 Bravo 29er. You utilize a network of Delaware shell companies, specifically Apex Contracting Solutions, to structure illicit cash through local bank branches in deposits of exactly $9,900 to avoid currency transaction reports. Trent's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the edge of the rough stone mantel to remain upright, his knuckles turning white. You do not develop commercial real estate, Trent, I continued, the steady rhythm of my delivery echoing off the high ceilings and the massive glass windows. You function as a localized money laundering node. You move $2 million every single month for the Sinaloa Syndicate distribution network operating through the Mid-Atlantic corridor. The blood completely drained from his face. The color vanished in real time, leaving his skin the shade of wet mortar. The local municipal officials standing near him scrambled backward, stumbling over the expensive rugs, creating a massive physical void around him the moment I spoke the cartel's name out loud. "The drive," Trent whispered, his voice cracked, sounding desperate, thin, and hollow. "We took the drive from your office. I saw the ledgers. You didn't know about Cyprus." I clasped my hands loosely in front of me, resting them against the charcoal wool of my dress. You orchestrated a felony breaking and entering to extract evidence. You hired syndicate associates to smash my window, but you did not steal my primary ledgers. Trent, you stole a decoy, a sacrificial hard drive I fabricated entirely to satisfy your paranoia. Fiona let out a sharp, involuntary whimper from her position by the catering doors, her hands dropping to cover the cartel-funded diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, as if the stone suddenly burned her skin. I kept the true, unredacted data securely encrypted, I explained, gesturing toward the manila folder resting on the glass coffee table. The documents in that folder contain the transmission receipts. I did not bring the evidence into this house. I routed the complete dossier including your offshore wire logs, your Delaware employer identification numbers, and the cartel's operational fingerprint through a secure proxy server. I paused, letting the silence crush the remaining oxygen from his lungs. I watched his eyes dart around the room, hunting for an exit, hunting for a loophole. I closed it. The data packets transmitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Cyber Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 3 hours ago, I stated. Trent stopped breathing. His jaw went slack. The exact timing delivered the lethal blow. 3 hours provided the federal algorithms ample time to ingest the data, flag the routing numbers, and initiate the automated bureaucratic response. The transmission hit the servers at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, bypassing any local interference. He possessed no window to run. He held no opportunity to liquidate his assets, shred his physical files, or contact his offshore brokers to sever the connections. I trapped him inside the estate, forcing him to drink expensive bourbon and boast to local politicians while the federal government systematically dismantled his empire behind his back. He looked at Gideon, seeking a shred of familial mercy, searching for the brother he had manipulated and endangered for a decade. Gideon did not lower his weapon. Gideon stared back at him with absolute, unforgiving disgust, the federal agent recognizing the criminal standing before him. I did not need a firearm to execute justice. A bullet delivers a fast, chaotic conclusion, leaving room for doubt and legal maneuvering. I desired a slower, far more comprehensive destruction. I weaponized my intellect. I utilized my specialized federal expertise. I deployed absolute bureaucratic annihilation. The paper resting on the glass table represented an inescapable, permanent cage of digital and legal iron, and they had walked directly into it and locked the door themselves. The veneer of aristocratic solidarity dissolved in less than 10 seconds. Sylvia broke first, the matriarch who orchestrated the family dynamics with an iron fist, who dictated seating arrangements and mocked my wardrobe, completely unraveled. She dropped her empty hand. She did not look at the shattered crystal or the spilled champagne soaking her emerald silk gown. She thrust a trembling, manicured finger directly at her eldest son. "I knew nothing about this," Sylvia shrieked. The cultured, resonant tone of the country club vanished, replaced by the shrill, guttural panic of a trapped animal. "I simply asked you to organize his receipts. I did not know about Cyprus. Trent handles the banking. He manages the contractors. I have absolutely zero involvement in his commercial enterprises." She offered her own flesh and blood to the federal government without a fraction of a second's hesitation, desperately attempting to construct a firewall of plausible deniability. Trent ignored her completely. His mother's betrayal failed to register through his escalating adrenaline. The fight-or-flight response flooded his nervous system, and he chose flight. He abandoned his position against the stone hearth, lunging forward. He targeted the weakest link in the room. "Fiona!" Trent roared, his voice cracking, tearing through the silent, paralyzed crowd of guests. He crossed the floor, his bespoke suit pulling taut across his shoulders. He grabbed his wife by the upper arm, his fingers digging violently into the silk of her designer dress. "Get your purse." "Where are the keys? Give me the keys to the car right now." Fiona shrieked, twisting away from his grip. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the heavy fringe of the Persian rug. Her clutch slipped from her grasp, spilling a gold compact, a tube of lipstick, and a cell phone across the hardwood. She did not reach for the items. She covered her face with her hands, the cartel-funded diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light as she began to sob. "Don't touch me," Fiona screamed, her chest heaving. "I don't know anything. You told me the money came from the residential leases. I just signed the tax returns. I am not going to federal prison for you." "Trent." I stood beside the glass coffee table and observed the wreckage. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I watched the absolute disintegration of their arrogance with the icy, detached precision of a scientist documenting a chemical reaction. The powerful, untouchable dynasty evaporated. The bespoke suits, the emerald gowns, the imported luxury vehicles, it all stripped away, leaving only cowardly, terrified criminals tearing at each other's throats to survive. Trent dropped Fiona's arm. He spun around, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward the front double doors, mapping the distance to the driveway. "Do not waste your energy running." "Trent," I said. My voice cut through their screaming, maintaining that flat, academic cadence. "It is mathematically impossible." He froze, his shoulders hitching, slowly turning his head back toward me. I opened the manila folder sitting on the glass table. I did not rush. I deliberately folded back the cover, exposing the stark white pages. I pulled the top document free and held it up by the corner. "This is the automated transmission receipt generated by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I explained, tracking his gaze as he stared at the paper. The algorithmic sequence initiated exactly 3 hours ago, the moment the federal mainframes ingested the offshore routing codes and the Delaware employer identification numbers. They engaged an immediate, system-wide civil asset freeze. I let the paper drop back onto the table. It landed with a soft slap against the glass. You possess no liquid capital, I continued, mapping out his ruined reality. Your domestic accounts are locked. Your commercial credit lines are severed. Your passports flagged the moment the cyber division verified the syndicate operational signature. If you attempt to use a credit card to purchase fuel, the terminal will lock, and local law enforcement will receive your exact geographic coordinates. If you manage to start your vehicle, the highway patrol will intercept you before you reach the interstate on-ramp. You have absolutely nowhere to go. Trent stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, his brain failing to process the totality of the destruction. Sylvia, however, possessed a more venomous survival instinct. She realized running offered no physical salvation. She pivoted, abandoning her denial, and sought legal leverage. She sought a hostage. She looked directly at Gideon. Gideon, Sylvia gasped, her eyes wide, clutching the stained fabric of her gown. Gideon, you must stop her. You must retract the files. Your name is on the family trust. I listed you as a secondary beneficiary. If the federal government seizes my estate, they seize your assets. The Bureau will investigate you. You will lose your badge. You will go to federal prison alongside your brother. She weaponized his career, attempting to use the threat of his own professional annihilation to force him to silence me. Gideon's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck strained. He knew the federal guidelines. He understood the catastrophic implications of his name appearing on a cartel-funded trust document. He shifted his grip on his service weapon, his eyes locked on his mother, visibly disgusted by her willingness to drag him into a concrete cell to save her own skin. I reached into the folder a second time. I extracted the final document. I addressed that vulnerability 3 weeks ago. Sylvia, I stated. I held up the heavy, watermarked paper. The bright blue ink of the county clerk's official seal gleamed at the bottom of the page. This is a formal, irrevocable renunciation of interest, I explained, presenting the document to the room. I utilized my designated power of attorney over our joint marital assets to legally sever Gideon's name from your estate. I executed the filing last month, establishing a documented, backdated legal barrier, citing an ethical conflict of interest regarding his federal employment. I looked at Gideon. I met his eyes. The tension bleeding from his posture mirrored the sudden, profound realization sweeping across his face. He looked at the document, then looked back at me, understanding the sheer magnitude of the protection I engineered for him while he slept. I built a reinforced steel wall around his career, ensuring the incoming federal strike would bounce harmlessly off his badge. I turned back to Sylvia. I dropped the renunciation document onto the table, placing it directly over the transmission receipts. Gideon owns nothing in your portfolio, I said. He inherits nothing. The cartel taint cannot touch him. The Department of Justice will audit his files and find a pristine, preemptive legal severance executed long before the criminal indictments landed. He is completely, legally immune to your collapse. Sylvia's mouth hung open. The final, desperate weapon she attempted to wield shattered into useless pieces against the floorboards. She stared at the paper. She stared at the heavy brass seal. Then, she looked at me. For 3 years, she looked at me and saw a low wage, community college tutor. She saw scuffed leather loafers and a faded charcoal dress. She saw a weak, defenseless mouse she could torment, isolate, and discard without consequence. The illusion finally died. Sylvia, Trent, and Fiona stared at me in the center of the silent, ruined living room. The understanding washed over them, cold and absolute. They did not invite a naive subordinate into their accounts to act as a human shield. They handed the blueprint of their entire criminal empire directly to a former senior forensic auditor for the United States Treasury Department. They actively taunted the exact apex predator specifically trained to dismantle corporate syndicates. I did not flinch. I did not break. I absorbed their insults, processed their ledgers, and methodically constructed the instruments of their destruction while they poured my coffee and mocked my salary. I did not merely outsmart them. I utilized their own staggering arrogance to orchestrate their absolute administrative annihilation. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, the heavy brass pendulum swinging in the absolute silence of the paralyzed room. The guests held their breath, pressing themselves tighter against the walls. Then, the silence anchoring the living room fractured. A sharp, electronic vibration buzzed against the heavy wool of Trent's bespoke midnight blue suit jacket. The mechanical hum sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the high ceilings and cutting through the stagnant, suffocating air. Trent flinched. He stared down at his own chest, treating the tailored pocket as if it contained a live explosive device. Gideon maintained his grip on the compact sidearm, keeping the muzzle angled downward toward the oak floorboards. He did not issue a verbal command. He simply tipped his chin toward Trent's jacket, authorizing the physical movement. Trent reached inside the wool fabric. His fingers trembled violently. Lacking basic motor control, he extracted a slim, black smartphone. The backlit screen illuminated the ashen, sweating skin of his face. He swiped his thumb across the glass, accessing the incoming notifications. I watched his eyes track left to right, processing the digital text. The first message arrived from his commercial real estate broker. He read the words aloud, his voice stripped of all former arrogance, reduced to a hollow, grating rasp. Escrow rejected. Accounts locked. Bank compliance citing federal hold. Trent stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the glass, his brain struggling to process the mathematical impossibility of a zero balance. The device buzzed a second time. A restricted number flashed across the display. The syndicate did not utilize names. They operated through encrypted routing channels. The message contained 0 pleasantries, delivering a cold, lethal inquiry. Cyprus inaccessible. Nicosia branch flagged by Securities and Exchange Commission. Where is the cash? Trent. The cartel realized the failure of their primary domestic node. They watched their $2 million vanish into a federal void. And they directed their immediate, violent focus entirely upon the architect of that failure. Trent's knees buckled. The phone slipped from his sweat-slicked fingers. The device struck the hardwood floor, the glass screen shattering upon impact. He did not attempt to retrieve the hardware. He leaned heavily against the rough stone of the hearth, burying his face in his hands, gasping for oxygen that his lungs refused to process. The bureaucratic guillotine did not stop with Trent. The algorithmic execution possessed no mercy, recognized no familial boundaries, and operated at the speed of fiber optic transmission. It systematically hunted every financial artery connected to the Delaware shell companies. A heavy silver clutch sitting on the mahogany console table chimed, Sylvia's personal device. Fiona's smartphone, lying discarded on the Persian rug beside her spilled gold compact, illuminated the floorboards. The screen displayed an automated alert from a premier credit card issuer. Account suspended pending federal review. I maintained my position behind the glass coffee table, resting my hands against the faded charcoal wool of my oversized dress. I projected my voice across the frozen room, ensuring every hidden guest, every local municipal official, and every catering staff member heard the absolute reality of the situation. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network does not operate on a standard judicial timeline, I explained, delivering the legal parameters with academic, unyielding precision. When an authenticated federal auditor submits a verified tracking matrix connecting domestic cash deposits directly to flagged cartel accounts in Cyprus, the system bypasses the local magistrate. The cyber division executes a blanket freeze on every social security number and employer identification number tied to the network. I looked at Fiona. She remained pressed against the heavy wooden catering doors, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically toward the shattered phone on the floor. The United States Code authorizes the immediate civil asset forfeiture of any property derived from the proceeds of illicit enterprise, I stated. I gestured toward her left arm, which she currently held tight against her stomach. The diamond tennis bracelet strapped to your wrist. Fiona. You bragged about the custom platinum setting tonight. You utilized it to perform your superiority over your cousins. That jewelry no longer belongs to you. It constitutes federal evidence, purchased with structured cash deposited into the Apex Contracting Solutions shell account last month. The Treasury Department owns those stones. Fiona choked on a violent sob. She grabbed her left wrist with her right hand, attempting to hide the diamonds beneath the silk fabric of her designer dress, as if concealing the stones could reverse the federal mandate. I shifted my gaze to Sylvia. The matriarch stared at me, her manicured hands gripping the fabric of her skirt. You constructed a dynasty on a foundation of unrecorded currency, I continued, analyzing the architectural space surrounding us. You financed the Italian marble in the foyer with syndicate cash. You paid the private contractors in crisp $100 bills pulled directly from Trent's laundering cycle. The estate trust funded the quarter-acre of imported European cobblestone in the driveway. Sylvia shook her head. A slow, desperate, involuntary denial. No, this is my home. This is my property. You own nothing, Sylvia, I corrected, closing the final psychological door. The federal government seized the deed to this property exactly 3 hours ago. The title currently sits locked in a civil forfeiture holding account in Washington. You are trespassing on federal land. The absolute reality of their destitution settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. They did not simply face federal indictment and decades in a penitentiary. They faced instantaneous, grinding poverty. The algorithms stripped them of their resources in a matter of seconds. They possessed no liquid capital to hire elite criminal defense attorneys. They held no valid credit cards to purchase a hotel room for the night. They owned no vehicles to flee the jurisdiction. The $250,000 custom German sports car sitting on the cobblestone outside belonged to the United States government. The bespoke midnight blue suit Trent wore belonged to the evidence locker. Gideon maintained his tactical stance, keeping the perimeter secure. But his eyes shifted from the barrel of his weapon to the faces of his family. He watched the blood drain from his mother's cheeks. He watched his brother collapse against the masonry. He realized he did not need to fire a single round to neutralize the threat. I had already executed them. I targeted the precise mechanism of their pride. They had used their illicit wealth as a weapon of domination, reducing my existence to a series of petty, routine humiliations to validate their own grandiosity. They assumed that because I lived quietly and without pretense, I was incapable of seeing through their elaborate financial illusions. But their arrogance became their blind spot. I stripped that stolen armor away, leaving them utterly exposed in the middle of their own crumbling stage. The quiet in the living room shifted. The heavy anticipation of physical violence evaporated, replaced entirely by the hollow, echoing silence of total ruin. The string quartet packed their instruments quietly into velvet-lined cases, the latches clicking sharply in the quiet space. The catering staff backed through the swinging doors, abandoning the silver trays of seared scallops and caviar. The extended relatives and local politicians remained pressed against the glass terrace doors, desperately distancing themselves from the epicenter of the incoming federal strike. I did not need to raise my voice or demand apologies. I stood before them in simple attire, a person of zero consequence in their shallow world. Yet I was now the only individual in this room who remained legally free, with a bank account that wasn't frozen by federal decree. I looked at Trent, sobbing silently against the fireplace, sliding down the stones until he sat on the hearth. I looked at Fiona, sliding down the heavy wooden door until she sat on the floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. I looked at Sylvia, her posture collapsing, the grand matriarch reduced to a shivering, terrified elderly woman standing in a puddle of ruined champagne. They had built a prison out of their own boundless greed, and they had handed me the keys. I simply stepped outside, turned the lock, and let the relentless machinery of the federal state bury them alive. The silence in the room solidified, heavy and final, like a tomb sealing over their ruined empire. The hollow, echoing silence anchoring the living room fractured. The disruption did not originate from within the estate. It arrived from the outside, bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass panels framing the terrace. Intense, rhythmic pulses of brilliant light sliced through the freezing December darkness. Red and blue strobes washed across the frost-covered lawn, pierced the glass, and swept over the imported Persian rugs. The alternating colors illuminated the pale, terrified faces of the guests, casting long, erratic shadows against the vaulted ceiling. The low, heavy rumble of powerful engines vibrated through the floorboards. Heavy, specialized vehicle tires crushed the imported European cobblestone in the driveway. Car doors slammed shut in rapid, staggered succession. The sharp, metallic clatter of tactical gear striking asphalt echoed through the front yard. Gideon did not trigger a panic button. He did not dial emergency services on his cell phone. I engineered the raid. When I coded the automated transmission sequence in my home office. I did not merely target the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. I routed a specific, highly prioritized data packet directly to the encrypted terminal belonging to Gideon's task force commander at the Federal Field Office. The dossier contained the exact Cyprus routing numbers the task force had hunted for a year, paired directly with Trent's physical address. When the federal algorithms verified the syndicate's operational signature, the commander did not hesitate. He did not call Gideon to verify the target. He mobilized the tactical response unit instantly, classifying the estate as an active cartel distribution hub. The heavy oak double doors at the front of the foyer did not swing open. They shattered. A kinetic battering ram struck the wood with deafening, concussive force. The heavy brass hinges screamed, tearing free from the doorframe. The oak panels splintered, exploding inward, spraying shards of wood across the Italian marble entryway. Men and women clad in heavy, olive-drab ballistic armor poured into the house. They moved with aggressive, synchronized precision. A swarm of tactical efficiency flooding the foyer and fanning out into the living room. Brilliant. Blinding beams from weapon-mounted flashlights cut through the glare of the crystal chandelier, sweeping over the terrified crowd. Federal agents, show your hands. Keep your hands where we can see them. The commanding shouts overpowered the lingering classical music. The guests shrieked, dropping to their knees, pressing their palms flat against the walls and the glass terrace doors. The local municipal officials threw themselves onto the floorboards, desperately seeking compliance. Gideon did not raise his weapon toward the breaching team. He executed a flawless, tactical de-escalation. He dropped his thumb, releasing the magazine from the grip of his compact sidearm. The loaded magazine fell, clattering against the hardwood. He pulled the slide backward, ejecting the chambered round. The single brass cartridge spun through the air, bouncing near my shoe. He slid the empty, cleared weapon smoothly into his inside-the-waistband holster in one fluid motion. He reached into his breast pocket using 2 fingers, extracting his leather credential case. He snapped it open, holding the gold federal shield high above his head, catching the beam of a tactical flashlight. "Special Agent Gideon Caldwell," he shouted, projecting his voice over the chaos, calling out his badge number to the entry team. "Friendly blue-on-blue target is secure." A tactical commander wearing a heavy Kevlar helmet lowered his rifle, recognizing the shield and the agent. The commander barked an order into his shoulder-mounted radio. "Clearing our immediate quadrant." Gideon lowered his credentials. He stepped backward, anchoring himself firmly at my right shoulder. Closing ranks, he presented a united front, standing as a physical barrier between the raiding party and his wife. The raid swept past us, targeting the syndicate. 2 agents wearing heavy plate carriers approached Sylvia. The matriarch attempted to deploy the final, desperate weapon remaining in her arsenal: manufactured, fragile victimhood. She dropped to her knees, staining the torn hem of her emerald silk gown in the puddle of spilled champagne. She produced loud, ragged, gasping sobs. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing tears to carve dark, messy tracks through her expensive foundation. She reached out, grabbing the rigid nylon webbing of the arresting agent's tactical vest, tilting her chin upward to display her trembling lips. She begged for mercy. She claimed she possessed a weak heart. She insisted she existed merely as a frail, confused widow who understood nothing about offshore banking. The federal agent did not blink. He did not offer a comforting hand. The machinery of justice possesses absolutely zero capacity for empathy, and it remains entirely immune to theatrical grief. The agent grabbed Sylvia by the upper arms, breaking her grip on his vest. He hauled her to her feet with zero gentleness. He twisted her wrists sharply behind her back. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The ratcheting, metallic clicks of the teeth biting into place echoed sharply over her performative wailing. They secured the cuffs, locking her arms in a rigid, unnatural angle. Sylvia screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure humiliation, as the agent marched her toward the shattered front doors, dragging her across the ruined marble foyer. A second team converged on the stone hearth. They found Trent sitting on the masonry, staring blankly at the shattered smartphone resting on the floorboards. He did not fight the arresting officers. His cognitive functions had completely short-circuited under the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. Two agents grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him upright. His bespoke, midnight blue worsted wool suit bunched and wrinkled, the expensive tailoring completely ruined by the rough handling. Trent began to babble. He strung together a rapid, incoherent stream of corporate jargon and legal terms, speaking to no one. He mumbled regarding Cayman Island trusts, Delaware tax codes, and the necessity of retaining immediate defense counsel. He sounded like a malfunctioning machine, spitting out fragments of his shattered empire. The agents ignored his rambling. They secured his wrists behind his back. Trent offered zero resistance. His legs failed to support his weight. The agents dragged him across the center of the living room. The toes of his expensive, custom leather shoes scraped against the hardwood, leaving long, dark scuff marks across the floorboards. Fiona met the same fate. An agent approached her near the catering doors. Fiona did not scream. She simply held her left wrist tight against her stomach, weeping silently. The agent pulled her arms backward. The heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut, the cold metal locking directly over the cartel-funded diamond tennis bracelet she had flaunted mere minutes prior. The agent turned her around and marched her out of the house, her designer heels clicking erratically against the floor. I stood perfectly still behind the glass coffee table, resting my hands against the faded charcoal wool of my oversized dress. I did not move. I did not speak. I breathed in through my nose, drawing the cold, chaotic air into my lungs. 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. My pulse maintained a steady, unyielding rhythm of 60 beats per minute. I observed the absolute destruction of my abusers. I watched the federal agents rip the arrogance from the room. I watched them dismantle the dynasty piece by piece, dragging the criminals out into the freezing December night, loading them into the back of armored transport vehicles. The strobing red and blue lights illuminated the empty spaces they left behind. The coiled spring inside my chest, compressed by years of passive-aggressive insults, financial gaslighting, and the sheer terror of an attempted assassination, finally snapped back, the tension released, flooding my veins with cold, absolute, and inescapable catharsis. I watched the machinery of justice remove the rot from my life, knowing I built the entire engine with my own 2 hands. The frost finally broke in the middle of April 2011. The freezing Virginia winds gave way to a gentle, humid thaw, washing the last remnants of winter from our neighborhood. I spent the weekend kneeling in the damp soil of our backyard, planting heirloom tomato seeds along the cedar fence line, dirt caked beneath my fingernails, embedding in the creases of my skin. I welcomed the grounding, honest labor. Gideon sat on the wooden deck steps, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, watching me work. He wore faded denim and a worn cotton shirt. The heavy leather federal holster did not sit on his hip. The crushing burden of his family's deception no longer dragged his shoulders toward the ground. The Department of Justice executed a brutal, Exhaustive internal audit in the weeks immediately following the December raid. The Office of Professional Responsibility tore through Gideon's digital footprint, his domestic bank records, and his operational field reports. They hunted for a single shred of complicity connecting him to the cartel distribution network. They found absolutely nothing. They discovered the irrevocable renunciation of interest I filed weeks before the arrest, verifying his legal severance from Sylvia's illicit estate. The bureaucratic wall I built around him held perfectly. The Bureau did not suspend him. Instead, the task force commander issued a formal commendation, placing a permanent letter in Gideon's file, recognizing his tactical de-escalation within a hostile, unsecure perimeter. He retained his badge. He kept his security clearance. The fire of the truth burned away the toxic familial rot, cauterizing the wound permanently. Our marriage emerged from the ash stronger, anchored by absolute, unbreakable trust. We survived the blast radius because we stood in the center of the truth. Trent did not survive. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse gallery when the magistrate delivered the final verdict. The dark mahogany paneling of the courtroom felt heavy and severe, a stark contrast to the glittering chandeliers of his former life. Trent stood at the defense table. The federal marshals had stripped him of his bespoke midnight blue worsted wool suits months prior. He wore a standard issue, shapeless orange jumpsuit. Heavy steel chains bound his wrists and ankles, clanking sharply against the hardwood floor every time he shifted his weight. His elite defense attorneys abandoned him the exact moment the automated civil asset forfeiture algorithms drained his retainer accounts to a zero balance. He relied entirely on an overworked public defender who possessed zero legal leverage against the mountain of forensic evidence I delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal magistrate read the charges into the public record: money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down, the crack echoing like a gunshot, delivering a 20-year federal sentence without the possibility of early parole. Trent did not shout. He did not boast about commercial acquisitions or municipal zoning permits. His shoulders collapsed. He stared blankly at the polished defense table, fully comprehending that he would spend the next 2 decades in a concrete cell measuring exactly 8 feet by 10 feet. The cartel syndicate abandoned him. The offshore holding companies vanished. The federal penal system swallowed the arrogant real estate developer whole, assigning him a 9-digit numeric designation and permanently erasing his name from the outside world. Sylvia avoided a federal penitentiary, but she did not escape her execution. She negotiated a frantic plea agreement during her first night in lockup, surrendering every single asset, account, and property she possessed to avoid dying behind steel bars. The government seized the sprawling 2-story brick colonial estate. They seized the Italian marble foyer, the crystal stemware, and the 1/4 acre of imported European cobblestone. They auctioned her designer wardrobe and her antique silver serving platters to the highest bidder. The local country club revoked her membership, striking her name from their registries overnight. Her high society friends stopped returning her phone calls, treating her like a highly contagious pathogen. I drove past her new residence once. She occupied a cramped, second-floor apartment in a state-subsidized concrete building situated directly beside a loud, relentless industrial highway. The heavy exhaust fumes from passing commercial trucks stained the exterior siding a permanent, oily gray. I imagined her sitting in a narrow kitchen, surrounded by peeling linoleum and chipped formica countertops. I pictured her drinking cheap, instant coffee from a cracked mug, staring out a dirty window at the roaring traffic. She possessed no catering staff to berate. She held no captive audience to command. The matriarch who previously orchestrated our family dinners like a royal court now lived in complete, humiliating obscurity. She traded her cartel-funded empire for a subsidized heating voucher. Her grinding poverty constituted a far more devastating punishment than any concrete cell could ever provide. Fiona flipped on Trent the moment the federal agents secured her in the interrogation room. She traded her cartel-funded diamond tennis bracelet and a full, recorded confession for absolute immunity. She filed for divorce, moved into her parents' basement, and deleted her entire social footprint, disappearing into the suburban void. I returned to my windowless room at the community college. I drove the exact same 9-year-old silver sedan into the faculty parking lot every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I stood in front of the whiteboard, inhaling the familiar scent of dry erase dust, and tutored 19-year-olds on the foundational mechanics of introductory accounting ledgers. They looked at my sensible flats and my faded cardigans. They saw a quiet, unassuming tutor. They possessed no idea they learned basic arithmetic from the apex predator who dismantled a multi-million-dollar cartel syndicate using a single manila folder. I embraced the anonymity. It served as a warm, impenetrable blanket. I deliver this truth directly to you. True power does not require an audience. It does not need to scream over a crowded dining table. It does not perform. It does not boast. And it certainly does not need to drape itself in imported silk or stolen diamonds to validate its existence. True power operates in the absolute quiet. It is the ability to absorb a strike, analyze the trajectory, and dismantle the attacker at the molecular level without ever raising your pulse above 60 beats per minute. If people mistake your quietness for weakness, let them. If they look at your sensible shoes and your calm demeanor and assume you are a fragile, defenseless target, do not correct their miscalculation. Let them build their arrogant empires on top of their own staggering ignorance. Allow them to pour the champagne and celebrate their perceived victories, because when the time comes to finally dismantle their cruelty, the silence they mistook for surrender will be the very thing that destroys them. Have you ever been underestimated by people who thought they held all the cards? What did you do when you finally showed your hand? Hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.